Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classic Lectures. We are now in lecture 105 in Thoreau's Walden, chapter number 6, Visitors. Now, the assumptions here are that you've already been paying attention to our stuff at learnstrong.net, especially in the Harvard Classics folder, lectures 99 through 104. And in our junior folder, I've made any number of lectures on specifically Thoreau, as well as, of course, the other transcendentalist thinkers, some of whom I've referred to already in some of these lectures and will even in this one. Also, I'm assuming that you know about our 3 levels of reading. At level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? 2A, themes, messages. We'll obviously see a few here, as well as 2B, not what is said by Thoreau, but how he says it. And then finally, at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? It's almost as if Thoreau wants to reach out and kind of pat you on the shoulder and say, hey, why don't you think about this for a second? At level 3A, how does this relate to things he's already said, and then, of course, other texts that we know of? And then finally, and most significantly for our learning theory of connecting new to old, how do I relate to this information in some meaningful way? The other assumption is that you're familiar with our Big Five, as we call it in 303. What does this chapter say about epistemology, what one can know, ontology, who one is, psychology, of course, the study of the individual mind, sociology, huge for this one in our chapter Visitors, that is to say the group of people together, and then finally, the question of theodicy. Why is it that evil and pain and suffering have to exist in this world, and how can we live with it? Now notice, we've mentioned this already in earlier lectures, but I call it a prose poem because it's so beautifully written, and to read it aloud, I feel as if I'm often reading a prose poem. But notice we move between polarities all the way through Walden. So for example, in chapter 5 we learned about his views on solitude and being alone. Now here we'll move to the other side of the pendulum swinging, and that is to say, what does he think about people and about the visitors who came to visit him as he was living here in Walden Pond? And of course, that is to say, we're talking about in our Big Five, the balance between psychology and sociology and the way, and of course, it's all integral, isn't it, right? Now, of course, the myth in regards to Thoreau is that he was, he was not a very gregarious person, not a very social person. He kind of disliked people and the like, which is in many ways a complete and utter fabrication. Even from our study of this poem, we'll recognize that, in fact, Thoreau loved to be around people. It was just in certain qualified ways, right? Let's summarize now really quickly chapter 6 and then get on to some reading of it. He will begin in this chapter by commenting that he isn't a hermit. He enjoys, being with people, but they have to be the right people. Worthwhile people is how he says it, right? He loves to talk about his communication, if you will, communication modus operandi. He talks about the difficulties in terms of space between himself and others, especially as it relates to being inside of his hut versus outside of his hut. He does talk about meaningful intimacy, intellectual communion, he will call it, which allows and does in fact require a certain understanding of silence, that is to say, the ability to consider what others have to say, to absorb. In many ways, Visitors is Thoreau's classic writing poem on communication theory and especially being a good listener, right? He says distance is hypercritical, especially the suspension of interest in the silly kinds of matters, the trivial stuff, right? He talks about companionship, and he says that really true companionship doesn't have much to do with all of the normal ways we think about xenia is our Greek word, hospitality and all of that. And then he starts into a really remarkable passage about one of his favorite pals, one of his favorite visitors, a French-Canadian, a woodchopper. He'll consider him a very simple, natural man, very direct, very skillful. He's quiet. He is solitary. He's also humble, although Thoreau's not totally sure that that's the right word because he's not sure how bright the guy is, right? Seems to be very contented. He has an animal nature. In fact, some have argued that Thoreau here sees the true animal man, and yet he at the same time points out that this Canadian is somewhat devoid of spiritual development and evolution as well. In other words, Thoreau isn't ready to say that he would like to be like this a Canadian woodchopper who just lives in the woods. In other words, Thoreau sees himself as something quite different from that. As much as he enjoys this woodchopper's temperament and all of that, he does say that at least at times he seemed to be able to think for himself, and he recognizes that the man does kind of, in terms of the question of theodicy, does accept the pain of the world in a kind of simpleton way. Although, interestingly, Thoreau points out that this man doesn't seem to have much of a desire, although he does have a book of arithmetic, but he doesn't seem to have much of a desire to really improve himself that much. Thoreau then talks about several other visitors. He talks about some what he calls half-wits, people who are not within society, accepted as being completely capable intellectually. He talks about runaway slaves. This is, of course, huge because Thoreau was one of the great first truly ardent abolitionists. And he talks about those who don't understand that it's time to leave. In other words, that ability to say, hey, you know what, I appreciate that you came to visit me, but I think it's time that you go ahead and leave. Some people just can't pick up on those cues, he points out, right? He does talk about young boys and young girls and young women who love to go out and walk in nature. And then he talks as well about some men of business and farmers, as he refers to them, who can't leave, right, all of their worries about work and all of that behind them. Finally, he talks about the greatest bores of all, the reformers, and this is what makes Thoreau such an iconoclast, right? They maybe come out to try to see if he will identify with their cause, and he calls them the most unwelcome of guests. He does enjoy, he says, though, the company of children. And this will remind us that Christ himself said, such are the kingdom of heaven. And this idea of children are capable of understanding things that adults sometimes have forgotten. He as well comments on railroad men who are maybe taking a little holiday, as well as fishermen, poets, and some philosophers who have come out from the village, maybe trying to, enjoy the woods for a few moments, and they bump into him. Let's just enjoy a few lines from the chapter Visitors. Again, as I've said many times, I'd love to read all of this to you. I love his opening lines, and it will sound very much like Lord Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage apostrophe to the ocean, where Byron says, it's not that I love men less or society less, I love nature more. And we're going to hear something very similar here. He says, I think I love society as much as most, and am ready enough to fasten myself like a bloodsucker for the time to any full-blooded man that comes in my way. So he uses the analogy of a tick, and of course using the term bloodsucker will make us think, wonder whether he's speaking in positive or pejorative, as Ayn Rand, for example, will do it in her novels Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. To what degree is Thoreau pleased with the idea that he can be a tick at times? I am naturally, he says, no hermit. So there it is. I mean, he admits out loud that, he enjoys being with other people. It's not like he just wants to be completely alone. He doesn't go to the woods just so he can live alone. He said he went to the woods to live deliberately, and a whole part of that is, of course, his exchanges with other people. He says, I am naturally no hermit, but might possibly sit out the sturdiest frequenter of the barroom if my business called me thither. He says, I had 3 chairs in my house, and of course everything is read symbolically in this poem, right? 1 for solitude, 2 for friendship, 3 for society. When visitors came in larger and unexpected numbers, there was but the 3rd chair for them all. But they generally economized the room by standing up. It was surprising, he says, how many great men and women a small house will contain. I've had 25 or 30 souls with their bodies at once under my roof, and yet we often parted without being aware that we had come very near to one another. Now, whether he's speaking quite literally or not, I mean, if you look at an actual facsimile of his hut, to put 30 people in it, it's kind of like putting 30 people in a phone booth. That's an old-fashioned reference for you guys. There aren't very many phone booths in America anymore, but there were these real small kinds of little settings. All right. He does say this early on in Visitors. He says, one inconvenience that I sometimes experience in so small a house, the difficulty of getting to a sufficient distance from my guest when we began to utter the big thoughts in big words. Now, there's a famous story about Thoreau and his visit with Walt Whitman. Apparently it didn't go very well, at least according to one or two observers. And part of it might have been what Thoreau is referencing right here. He feels like when he's having a conversation, he needs to have the right kind of space, and a small room doesn't allow it. He says, you want room for your thoughts to get into sailing trim and run a course or two before they make their port. I love how Thoreau thinks of conversation as sailing a ship. The bullet of your thought, another interesting word picture, the bullet of your thought must have overcome its lateral and ricocheting motion and fallen into its last and steady course before it reaches the ear of the hearer, else it may plow out again through the side of his head. It's a fascinating word picture. In other words, conversation requires a certain kind of, what we say as well in terms of learning theory in 303, a certain kind of background knowledge. I mean, it takes time to be able to say the kinds of things that one wants to say. I've had students that say, this Walden text is way too long. Why couldn't he have reduced it down to 2 chapters? And I think he's making his point right here, that it takes a long time sometimes to be able to get the bullet just right, if you will. Also, he says, our sentences wanted room to unfold and form their columns. And the interval, go back to what I said earlier in another lecture about how Emerson said Thoreau's lines are similar to his strides when he walks. And that is to say, Thoreau wanted to be able to have the room to be able to have the conversation that he needed to have. Individuals, he says, like nations, must have suitable, broad, and natural boundaries, even a considerable neutral ground between them, sounding very much like Plato's Republic, Book 8, the declension of state arguments. I have found it a singular luxury, he says, to talk across the pond to a companion on the opposite side. It's a great word picture, and of course it can be extrapolated to have its spiritual and emotive and linguistic understandings as well. It's sometimes fun to have a conversation over distance, over time, right? I could say as much to those of you who are not in 303, but rather are in 303, if you get my drift, watching, of course, over time and space. He says it this way, speech is for the convenience of those who are hard of hearing. But there are many fine things which we cannot say if we have to shout. As he says, the conversation began to assume a loftier and grander tone. We gradually shoved our chairs further apart till they touched the wall in opposite corners, and then commonly there was not room enough. Now it's interesting, the last time you had a real heart-to-heart conversation, qualify how that in terms of spacing worked. Maybe you were walking with someone, at times you were close, at other times you started to kind of get a little bit distant from the individual. It's a very interesting idea. There's so many great concepts here that I have to skip over, but I'll skip now into the middle of this chapter. As for men, they will hardly fail one anywhere. I had more visitors while I lived in the woods than at my other period, than at any other period of my life. I mean, I had some. I met several there under more favorable circumstances than I could anywhere else, but fewer came to see me on trivial business. In this respect, my company was winnowed by my mere distance from town. In other words, if they wanted to talk to me, they had to have some reason to come out there to talk to me, as opposed to idle talk, silly talk, we might say, right? Think about all the texting that's sent and received, okay, I'll say it, by you and by me, but it doesn't mean anything, right? That is to say what T.S. Eliot says in The Hollow Men, we are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Alas, our dry voices, when we whisper, are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry grass, or rats' feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. I think Thoreau had a tremendous influence on T.S. Eliot, whether we wanted to admit it or not, and we'll get that sense right here as well. He says, I had withdrawn so far within the great ocean of solitude, we think about the last chapter, right, into which the rivers of society empty, that for the most part, so far as my needs were concerned, only the finest sediment was deposited around me. Besides, there were wafted to me evidences of unexplored and uncultivated continents on the other side. It's a brilliant way to think about Walden Pond as being a metaphor for the best kinds of people to have conversations with, what Plato will refer to as the interloculars. Those interlocute means to speak. I'm speaking with you now. We are interlocuting. He says, you know, it's fun to have the very best kinds of conversation. And I think if there's anything that we today are losing in much of our technologically driven kind of linguistic exchanges, it is the ability to communicate face to face. I'm certain that Thoreau would say, we probably need to just get together and take nice long walks, he called it sauntering, and have a bit of conversation with each other. We probably would come to better understandings this way. He says just a few lines later about a Canadian woodchopper who he met, and a postmarker as well. He says, this Canadian woodchopper and postmaker who can hold 50 posts in a day, it's a strong, strong man, who made his last supper on a woodchuck which his dog caught. He too has heard of Homer, Thoreau will tell us. And if it were not for books, he would not know what to do rainy days, quote unquote. Though perhaps he's not read one wholly through for many rainy seasons. Now, this will be a fascinating case study in terms of how to set up Thoreau against maybe the more natural man. We think of Rousseau and the idea of the natural man. To him, he says a little later, Homer was a great writer, though what his writing was about, he did not know. A more simple and natural man it would be hard to find. Vice and disease were cast such a somber moral hue over the world, seemed to have hardly any existence for him. He's childlike in many ways. In him, he says a few paragraphs later, the animal man chiefly was developed. Just a few lines before that he says, such an exuberance of animal spirits had he, that he sometimes tumbled down and rolled on the ground with laughter at anything which made him think and tickled him. Looking round upon the trees, he would exclaim, by George, I could enjoy myself well enough here chopping. I want no better sport. Back to this animal man, he says, Thoreau says, in physical endurance and contentment, he was cousin to the pine and the rock. I asked him once if he was not sometimes tired at night after working all day, and he answered with a sincere and serious look, Gorpit, I never was tired in my life, end quote. Very fascinating, but he says, the intellectual and what is called spiritual man in him were slumbering as an infant. Now, we maybe know people like this. They're wonderful to be around, but if you just give them the six-pack and the TV remote, they're happy, they're content. That is not Thoreau. When he says simplify, 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 he does not mean that. He doesn't mean this even, right? That is to say, we must reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn, he says, right, in chapter 2. He says, the intellectual, what's called spiritual in him, was slumbering as in an infant. He'd been instructed only in that innocent and ineffectual way in which the Catholic priests teach the Aborigines, by which the pupil is never educated to the degree of consciousness, but only to the degree of trust and reverence, and a child is not made a man, but kept a child. Now, there are many, of course, of us who are in the profession of teaching that look at a line like this, and we have to listen to what Thoreau has just said. Our job as instructors, of course, is to challenge students to develop that degree of consciousness, right? Not just to trust and reverence. We don't just look at these texts to reverence them, even to appreciate them, but to, of course, be ready to address them in very critical ways, maybe even to reject them, as we say. We are the stories we tell and retell, the stories we accept, the stories we reject. When nature made him, Thoreau continues, when nature made him, she gave him a strong body and contentment for his portion, and propped him on every side with reverence and reliance, that he might live out his 80 years and 10. A child, he was so genuine and unsophisticated that no introduction would serve to introduce him, more than if you introduced a woodchuck to your neighbor. He had got to find him out as you did. In other words, there was no, you couldn't see there was any real depth to him. He would not play any part. Men paid him wages for work, and so helped to feed and clothe him, but he never exchanged opinions with them. He was so simply and naturally humble, if he can be called humble, who never aspires, that humility was so distinct quality in him, nor could he conceive of it. Wiser men were demigods to him. This takes us back to Bacon's of Studies. Wise men, simple men admire the studies, but wise men use them. And this is that admiration society thing that Bacon's talking about in the studies. Wiser men were demigods to him. If you told him that such a one was coming, as did as he thought that anything so grand would expect nothing of himself, but take all the responsibility on himself and let him be forgotten still. He never heard the sound of praise. He particularly reverenced the writer and the preacher. Their performances, Thoreau says, were miracles. And then he continues, I heard that a distinguished wise man and reformer asked him if he did not want the world to be changed, and he answered with a chuckle of surprise in his Canadian accent, not knowing that the question had ever been entertained before, no, I like it well enough. Now, this is fascinating because Thoreau will say, it would have suggested many things to a philosopher to have dealings with him. To a stranger, he appeared to know nothing of things in general. Yet I sometimes saw in him a man whom I had not seen before, and I did not know whether he was as wise as Shakespeare or as simply ignorant as a child, whether to suspect him of a fine poetic consciousness or of stupidity. Now, we'll be reminded, of course, in the Tao Te Ching, that the same sentiment is echoed. Do you think that you can improve the world? I do not think it can be done. But notice Thoreau here will have some criticism of this notion that if somebody says the world is fine just the way it is, they probably haven't spent much time studying history, because obviously Hitler's must be stopped. We cannot just simply say, it's just the way that it is, right? And so Thoreau will sometimes point out the weakness in the spiritual dimension. He could, just to continue, he could defend many institutions better than any philosopher, because in describing them as they concerned him, he gave the true reason for their prevalence, and speculation had not suggested to him any other. At another time, hearing Plato's definition of a man a biped without feathers, and that one exhibited a cock plucked and called it Plato's man, he thought it an important difference that the knees bent the wrong way. Thoreau's got this kind of humor all the way through his poem. He would sometimes exclaim, how I love to talk. By George, I could talk all day. I asked him once, when I had not seen him for many months, if he had got a new idea this summer. Good Lord, said he, a man that has to work as I do, if he does not forget the ideas he's had, he will do well. In other words, I got no new ideas. I'm just trying to remember the old ideas that were once new ideas to me. Maybe the man you hoe with is inclined to race. Then by gory, your mind must be there. You think of weeds. Now this is fascinating because on one level, this is exactly what Thoreau will preach about being in the present and all of